Engaged in conservation efforts throughout the central Great Plains, Audubon of Kansas maintains a wildlife sanctuary on a 5,000-acre ranch along the Niobrara River in the Sand Hills of northern Nebraska. During the 1980s, Executive Director Ron Klataske, who was then employed by the National Audubon Society, collaborated with local rancher Harold Hutton and other ranch landowners to help gain recognition for the Niobrara as a National Scenic River, which was granted in 1991. Not long after Harold's death, 10 years later, his wife Lucille asked Audubon of Kansas to accept the property and manage it as both a working ranch and as a wildlife sanctuary. A small portion of the ranch has been set aside for the return of prairie dogs to this landscape. Recently, some new arrivals came to join those already established here.
Oh my goodness, you is a fatty McFatty.
We were asked to help with rescue and removal and relocation of some prairie dogs. Doane College had a property that had maybe 50 acres of grassland and a fairly substantial prairie dog colony. And they sold the property that had been willed to them, and the new owner, his desire was to plow it up and plant it to soybeans. And in fact, by the time we were alerted to the concern, it had already been plowed up and planted to soybeans. But there were maybe 250 prairie dogs that were still living in the soybean field. And so we instituted a trapping program to trap and relocate those prairie dogs. We eventually enlisted the help of the Nebraska Wildlife Rehab group out of the Omaha area, and we expanded the partnership and got volunteers, and many folks wanted to see some of these prairie dogs rescued. And we wanted to expand our colony here. And all total, 223 prairie dogs were captured and relocated here.
These prairie dogs were first placed in small cages intended to protect them while they got established in their new homes. An opening inside the cage allowed access to another enclosed area underground, designed to protect them from predators as they got acclimated. Within a few days, the cages would be removed and the prairie dogs could roam freely.
Whenever we could, family groups were retained together. And prairie dogs live in family groups called coteries, and that social structure is important, so we moved family groups together.
The question that presents itself at the outset: why was Ron Klataske and Audubon so intent upon instituting a reintroduction program on this ranch?
Prairie dogs, which are native to the Great Plains and native to this area, have been largely extirpated throughout most of their range. I had seen prairie dog colonies here in the late 70s and early 80s, and they just gradually got eliminated. And it's a tragedy when native wildlife, particularly for a keystone species that is so important for many other species of life, is eliminated from the landscape.
Prairie dogs, with their burrow structures, provide habitat for many other species, from ornate box turtles and tiger salamanders to a number of grassland birds that more easily catch insects in the short grass. There are also badgers and birds of prey, like ferruginous hawks and golden eagles, that feed on the prairie dogs themselves.
Once you get rid of the prairie dogs, then the predators that are associated with the prairie dogs vanish as well. And in addition to that, there's quite a few species of wildlife that thrive in the colonies themselves, in the burrows. And one of the more notable of the bird species that is associated with prairie dog colonies are burrowing owls. And they are migratory ground owls that are not very big, and they go down into burrows, usually abandoned burrows, and nest and raise their young there, and then they fly around and feed in the short grass on grasshoppers and beetles primarily. So I thought it was important for us to try to reestablish a colony on the sanctuary. The biggest hurdle was getting a permit from the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, primarily because of the fact that people think, well, if we're going to establish a new prairie dog colony, they're going to take over the countryside and the sky's going to fall, which is not the case. So there was quite a few people in the area that were in opposition to it. And so I had to have a number of safeguards, basically, to get approval from the state to establish this colony and move the prairie dogs. And one of those aspects was to build a poultry netting fencing around the colony. It goes a foot along the ground, 2 feet up, and then comes in a foot above. That has worked quite well, and it worked very well initially. Plus, we established tall vegetation, big blue stem, Indian grass, various wildflowers and things around the perimeter just outside of the 15-20 acre plot where we were reestablishing a colony. And the strategy there is prairie dogs don't like to go into tall vegetation. And so they stay pretty much where we have designed for them to be. And it's worked amazingly well. And part of our purpose is to demonstrate that you can have prairie dogs and they don't present any problems to the neighbors or on your particular property. In fact, they're very much a benefit, particularly if you like wildlife and a diversity of wildlife, which is a fundamental objective of the sanctuary, is to have a diversity of the native wildlife that would naturally occur here. You can't bring them all back, but prairie dogs is not a particular challenge.
As much success as they've had here so far, Ron continues to address questions of those who doubt the wisdom of bringing prairie dogs back into a landscape.
And there are a lot of myths about prairie dogs. The biggest myth about prairie dogs is that your livestock are going to break their legs, step in them. But there are all kinds of burros and four-legged livestock, cattle and horses, very seldom break legs. It just, for all practical purposes, doesn't happen. Another consideration thrown out about prairie dogs in a negative sense is, well, they'll eat all the grass. Well, they do clip the vegetation around their burrows because they need to be able to see predators. And they eat some, but of course they're only a couple pounds. They're not going to eat very much, but they do keep it clipped, which is kind of interesting because they create a more heterogeneous landscape, grassland landscape. And a lot of birds and other animals like swift foxes and other species like short grass areas that they can forage in. Even large grazers like pronghorns and bison and cattle will graze on prairie dog colonies at various times as a preference to nearby grassland areas because it's kind of like a lawn that gets clipped off and you get new vegetation come up and they say, hey, got new vegetation. Plus there's all the aeration of the soil and the recycling of nutrients that occurs. So for many native wildlife as well as livestock, they like grazing on it. But I would have to assume that in many cases they are consuming some biomass. But, if you have 5,000 acres, it's not that big of a deal if you have couple hundred acres that prairie dogs are utilizing. And that's what we hope that some other landowners will want to do here.